Everyone, and welcome to this year's 7th EPRC webinar. My name is Liliana Fonseca, and I'm a research assistant at the EPRC. In normal circumstances, these seminars would have taken place face-to-face at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, which we look forward to doing again in the future. Still, we are delighted to be able to welcome you all from a bit all over the world in this webinar today, and hopefully for future webinars as well. So today we have a presentation by EPRC's very own Professor Fiona Wishlade on how well does state aid transparency work. Before introducing our speaker, I would just like to inform you that this meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage, and the recording will then be made available on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. We would also like to encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar. I am sure you're all a bit familiar with the protocol for Zoom meetings, so I won't go into too much detail. I'll just like to remind you to keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking. You can also use the blue hand raise a hand function in Zoom if you'd like to make an intervention, or you can also use the chat function to send questions or comments throughout the presentation and for the Q&A. So I will present our speaker today. Fiona Wishlade is a professor at the University of Strathclyde, Director of EPRC Delft, and the Director of EPRC Glasgow. She has been with the EPRC for over 30 years, and she has worked on a number of research topics, including regional development policies across Europe, cohesion policy, and the negotiation of the EU budget and financial instruments. One of her key interests is state aid control, and especially how it affects domestic policies. She has been taking also a keen interest in the UK's subsidy regime post-Brexit. So I would just like to give the floor to Fiona.
Thanks very much indeed, Liliana, and it's great to see people from a number of different countries taking an interest in the topic. Maybe I can start by giving some very brief background and context for the study. So the study is about transparency issues in state aid, and transparency became a sort of a pillar of state aid control under the 2012 State Aid Modernisation initiative, which emphasised the notions of accountability, effectiveness, and a level playing field, which has in recent times come to be a very commonly used term in the UK negotiations on subsidies. But basically the idea underlying this is that firms should be able to find out what their competitors received in terms of state aid, that taxpayers should have a better idea of how public money was spent and should have access to information on that, and that the Commission should have a better understanding of how, where and why firms were being subsidised, and that could potentially lead to refinements in the way in which policy was operated and implemented. So from July 2016, this meant that awarding bodies had to report aid over 500,000 euros. This is something that applies essentially to all awarding bodies, whether they're national, regional, local agencies acting on behalf of the state, and so on. It applies to practically all areas of state aid. There are one or two areas where it doesn't, but in the mainstream of state aid control, it does. And the most prominent element of that is the general block exemption regulation, the GBA, which now accounts for the vast majority of aid awards, and which contain these specific transparency provisions. So the essence of it is that reporting has to be done within 6 months of the award, 12 months in the case of fiscal aid or tax aid. And the information has to be on a publicly accessible website. Now, the Commission didn't impose a system. It developed its own system, the Transparency Award Module, an IT platform that was developed specifically for the purpose, into which member states could report the information, or they could use their own domestic systems, provided that they were also publicly accessible and contained the minimum information requirements. And some countries already had such systems in place, which was why that this wasn't imposed. Okay, so something about the study, that's the sort of the background to transparency, but maybe I can say something about the study. It was done for DG competition, essentially during the course of the first half of last year, following a call for tenders. And the context for it was partly the review of the general block exemption regulation and the other state aid frameworks, which were coming up for renewal. Part of the objective was a kind of fact-finding process. How have member states gone about complying with the transparency requirements? And the second question, based on using the available data, was to determine whether some approaches to compliance are more effective than others. And then the third issue was whether there were any changes to the requirements or their implementation that would make compliance easier for member states. Okay, so moving on to the national systems for compliance. These essentially fell into a number of types. And we identified essentially 6 models, and those can be sort of like simplified into three main types. Okay, in this first type, we found 15 countries, and the essence here is that the onus is very much on the awarding bodies to ensure compliance. Legally, that tends to be the case. That tends to be the case everywhere. But in these countries, in general, what happens is that awarding bodies encode directly into the transparency module TAM. You can see that most, but not all, of the older EU member states fall into this group. In some cases in the UK, and which is part of our study in the transition year of Brexit, and in Germany, state aid coordination units have a role in supporting some awarding bodies, but in general, what's happening is that awarding bodies are encoding the information directly into the Commission system. Okay, in this second group, there are 10 countries, so more than half of countries are in the first type, where awarding bodies are encoding directly. In the second group of countries, there are slightly different approaches, but what they have in common is that there's a much more significant national coordination function. There's either a register, or the state aid coordination unit has a role in inputting the information and sometimes checking that information. One of the things to mention is that these things aren't static. When we undertook the study, state aid registers were being developed in Cyprus and Greece. I'm not sure whether they're up and running yet, but that would likely put those 2 countries into model 4 on this graphic, rather than model 3. The other thing to mention is that the domestic registers often fulfill other functions. For instance, compliance with the de minimis regulation and ensuring that those thresholds are not exceeded. So they aren't simply there to fulfill the transparency requirements. They're also fulfilling some domestic functions as well. Okay, and in the final group, TAM isn't used at all. So that's the case for Spain, Poland, and Romania. So they're fulfilling the obligation through having a domestic system that complies with the requirements. In all three cases, the amount of information collected is much more extensive than that required by the TAM. They collect information on awards of all sizes, not just those above 500,000 euros, although in Romania, the only part that's publicly available is that required by the Commission's transparency requirements. So moving on to say something about the effectiveness. The key question is whether we could say anything about the extent to which the different approaches had an impact on how compliant member states were with the transparency requirements. Now, in terms of the data, we had three main sources made available to us. The first is SARI, which is a system into which member states input information on the budget which they anticipate is needed or allocated for a given measure. And that's done when a measure or a scheme is reported under the GBA, for example, or if a measure is notified. The second data set was the actual register of awards under the TAM, so the transparency register, which is available online and contains all the details of the individual awards actually reported. And the third element was SANI, which is the annual, or I think it's called SANI 2 now, which is the annual reporting of spend by measure, which member states have to make to the Commission. So three useful and interesting data sets. But from our problem, a significant difficulty as well. So although we had information on the budget, on what was expected to be spent under a given measure, and although we had information then later on the outturn for a given measure in terms of spend, we rarely, if ever, had any information on the number of beneficiaries. Now, either of these would have given us an average value, which would have indicated whether or not a measure was likely to have made awards over the threshold, but that's not something that we had in any systematic way, because at the level of the initial reporting under SARI, that isn't currently required. But we did have detailed information on the timing of award decisions and reporting under the within the TAM. But as one of my colleagues put it, it was like being able to count the kids who were late for school, but not knowing how many didn't turn up at all. So it was a more partial view than we would have liked. What you can see here from that second data set, from the delays in reporting on TAM, is like a snapshot of the extent to which reporting was late. For technical reasons, we weren't able to incorporate the data on Spain, Poland, and Romania into this data set, which is a pity, but it just wasn't it wasn't feasible because of differences in the between the systems. Now, this doesn't include non-agricultural aid, but you can see that of 79,000 odd awards that were reported, about 40% of those were reported late. It's very difficult to make a judgment between countries here, because you can also see that the number of awards reported varies hugely between countries. But that gives you an overall kind of a snapshot of the sort of like the performance overall. Now, one of the things that we tried to do was to look at what might explain patterns of compliance in terms of the timeliness of the reporting, and we had six key predictors, if you like. So 3 of those relate to the characteristics of the aid, and 3 of those relate to the country characteristics. In terms of the aid characteristics, we thought that it might be more likely that if the award value was higher, it would be more likely to be reported, that a very large award would be more prominent, and that policymakers would be more conscious of it, and therefore ensure that it was reported on time. We also thought that there might be differences linked to aid type. Fiscal aid has a longer deadline for reporting, and often the tax system is a more like formal mechanism. So, is it possible that that could account for differences? For differences in the timeliness of reporting. And another factor was the legal basis. One of the important things about the GBA is that it's a sort of reverse policing system, insofar as state aid doesn't have to be notified in advance. Member states police themselves, but it's conditional on them complying with the terms of the GBA, so that and if they fail to do so, potentially the benefits of the GBA can be withdrawn. So we thought that there could be it could be more likely that countries would be timely in their reporting of GBA-based state aid than ones with another legal basis. In terms of the country characteristics, one of the things that we noted was that actually newer member states have fewer infringement proceedings against them, and might they be actually more compliant? Part of that is also associated with the fact that newer member states also had national state aid systems in place as part of the accession process, and we thought that that might have an impact on the level of compliance. Another factor was quality of government. There's a quality of government index, and we thought that perhaps the quality of government could impact on how well countries did in terms of reporting things in a timely fashion. And then, based on the profiles of the transparency systems that I've described earlier, the six different models and various aspects of those models, we gave each system a score for its stringency in the way that it regulated the role of awarding bodies, and how much scrutiny was undertaken by the coordinating state aid coordinating authorities and so on. So those were the 6 factors that were that were used. This was then applied in a regression, which the full details of this are in the paper, so I won't go through this table, but just maybe to summarize the outcomes. So they were, in a sense, as we expected. The larger the award, the less likely it was that reporting was delayed. GBER aid was less likely to be delayed than aid on the basis of other legal basis, and fiscal aid was also less likely to be delayed. But all of those effects were very small, and the country characteristics in terms of quality of government, regulatory stringency, and whether it was a new or an old member state, didn't change the outcome significantly. What really changed the outcome was the performance of the awarding bodies, and you can see this in the next slide, where what we've done is looked at to identify the number of awarding bodies, and then the number of awarding bodies reporting late. But in the final column is the share of late award reports accounted for by the single worst performing awarding body. And so you can see that in almost every country, a very large proportion of the late awards is accounted for by just one organization. And so that was the key determining factor in the timeliness of awards across the board, rather than anything attributable to wider systems. Okay, so the third element was to consider what changes there might be to transparency requirements that could potentially improve levels of compliance. And as part of this, we undertook 8 case studies where we tried to get a variety of countries, whether they were old and new member states, different parts of the EU geography, different levels of spend in terms of state aid as a percentage of GDP, and because we hadn't been able to integrate Spain, Poland and Portugal into the quantitative analysis, all 3 of those countries that had their own systems were integrated into the case study section of the report. In terms of the national perspectives, I think what came through very clearly is that in the main, countries didn't want things to change. In the type 1 countries, if you like, those are ones where awarding bodies are responsible for encoding in TAM. They didn't really want to see any additional reporting burdens. One of the questions, for instance, was whether the threshold would it be easier for countries if the threshold were lowered, so that they weren't having to filter out certain awards. And a very clear feedback from the type 1 countries was that they didn't want any additional burdens. And the type 2 countries where national registers are in place, again, they didn't want any changes either in the main, particularly any changes that would disrupt existing systems that would require additional information to be collected. There were various detailed suggestions for technical adjustments to things related to bulk uploads and that kind of thing, but no great appetite for significant investment in the sort of like digitalization of information collection. Now, overall, the kind of things that came up seem likely to address some of the kind of operational frustrations, if you like, of dealing with the TAM, but they also seem unlikely to address levels of compliance. Okay, in terms of conclusions, in terms of conclusions and some quite modest recommendations. First, as I've described, we can assess the timeliness of TAM reporting, but there isn't the data there to know anything about the completeness of that reporting. So it's a kind of a Rumsfeldian problem of the unknown unknowns, if you like. And one of the ways in which this could be helped would be by requiring member states to specify how many awards they anticipated would be made under a given scheme, and how many awards were actually made in a given scheme in the SARI and SANI to reporting. That wouldn't give a complete picture, but it would give, I think, a better idea of where there might be gaps in reporting. The second thing is that the overall timeliness of reporting to the TAM in every country is driven by the performance of a very few awarding bodies, and here, you know, the obvious thing would be the targeting and training of specific bodies and general awareness raising about the obligations. A third thing, which is a general point that goes back to the original objectives of the of TAM and transparency, is that one thing that came through was that TAM has little value added to the member states who only use TAM, whereas countries who have their own registers do find value in them. They might use them for monitoring what's happening in different departments. They might use them for audit, and they might use them for evaluation and so on. And so a wider question is, you know, whether there's a case for reviewing who TAM serves and how, because it is the case that we came across a degree of frustration in the type 1 countries, if you like, those with no register, but where awarding bodies have to report measures into the TAM, but where they don't particularly see any benefit. They don't use the TAM for anything other than reporting their own measures. So that's more or less it. Just to maybe just a quick postscript, which is that under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement signed between the EU and the UK, there is a specific chapter on subsidies. That also has within it a transparency requirement, which also specifies a time limit, the requirement for a public website, and, you know, similar data requirements too. The subsidies above 325,000 standard drawing rights, which I think is about 385,000 euros, are in scope of the TCA, and so one presumes that some adjustment will be required on the Commission side in terms of obligations on member states in order to comply with that. Just as the last slide, I've listed a link to the report, obviously to the Commission's transparency public search website. The 3 domestic websites for Spain, Poland, and Romania. We also have done a short blog and report on UK state aid and subsidy control after Brexit, for those who are interested in that. And BEIS, that's the UK Government Department for Business, Industry and Innovation, has just set up its own system for reporting, as that's now required by UK authorities, now that they're no longer bound by the EU state aid rules. But I think these slides are going to be shared with you, so you'll have the links for that if you're interested. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you, Fiona. That was a very interesting presentation, especially regarding the different typologies of the countries and their reporting. I would like to open the floor then to Q&A. If anyone has any questions, please either unmute or write them in the chat. You can also use the raise hand function on Zoom. If you don't know how that works, I think you can just go to the participants view and click there to raise your hand. I suppose no one has any questions right now. Kenneth Thomas, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Kenneth Thomas with Good Jobs First and Professor Emeritus at University of Missouri St. Louis. And one thing that we stumbled upon in doing some research is that in Sweden, at least, there are subsidies that have been given to Facebook for its data centers in Luleå. I'm not quite sure how that's pronounced, in northern Sweden. And they are not listed under the name of Facebook. They're listed under the name of a subsidiary called Pinnacle Sweden AB. And this seems odd to us. I mean, under the concept of a single undertaking, you would think that it would be listed under the name of the ultimate parent company. But we've been told by people at the commission that it only accepts, that the TAM only accepts ultimate beneficiaries that are European countries. I'm sorry, companies, and which doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, certainly US and other foreign companies have been receiving state aid in the EU for decades. I don't know if anybody else has run into something like that or not.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know if I can really enlarge much on that point. I mean, I think it's a kind of perennial issue of finding out that who the ultimate beneficiary of a given measure is. But I think we do have a couple of people here from the commission, I think. So I don't know if you maybe are better placed to come in on that on that point and maybe explain the context.
Yes, maybe I can say yes, I can say a few words. So thank you very much. So on the behalf of Teach Competition, I would like to thank you first for organizing this seminar, for the excellent overview of the also excellent study that you have conducted. And then for Kenneth, indeed we have a discussion with Job First in the United States. This is true. That's the concept of single undertaking in the meaning of transparency depends a bit on the cases. On the application is not straightforward. So we allow indeed member states to report sometimes the beneficiaries, which are the most easily to identify them. So that's the case of the Swedish subsidiaries of Facebook. But we are also modifying the TAM, but of course this is an IT issue, so it takes time to do it properly, to allow member state to report non-EU-based beneficiary in the TAM itself. And I think this answers the question.
Thank you, Antoine, and also thank you, Kenneth, for your comments. Do you have anything to add to that, Fiona, or should I go to another question?
No, I think if you have another question, maybe other people may well have questions for Antoine, but I think if you go to another question, that'd be good. Thank you.
Yes. Well, yes, anyone that has a question either for Fiona or I guess for Antoine can just unmute or write it in the chat. In the meantime, maybe Fiona, you could answer why countries then have such different systems. I know you've mentioned some of the different characteristics that could be involved in that, but maybe you can expand a bit.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's mainly, I think, about the context, and if you look at that first group of countries where awarding where there is sort of like 15 countries in it, and they are mainly old member states, the EU 15, and I think that the reason why they basically didn't sort of like modify very much what they did is kind of like maybe a path of least resistance. Those countries tended not to have very well developed state aid coordination units, because there'd never been really a kind of like never been a real requirement for that domestically or legally, and so often those have grown up a little bit organically without a kind of like a statutory role. In some of the newer member states in the countries that acceded in the 2000s, the accession agreements included provisions on state aids, and they had to establish state aid coordination authorities who basically played a role that was parallel to that of the Commission until such time as they joined the EU. So that meant that there was a kind of like a formal structure already there, and when countries joined the EU, that formal structure didn't have the same legal authority because that then went to the Commission, but the structures were still there and the expertise was still there, and they still tended to have a degree of authority over awarding bodies, which was absent in many of the older member states. There's maybe I think in some countries there's also been a sort of like a domestic motivation, for instance in Poland and Spain, to look at how public money is spent and have like a detailed accounting for that. And then in another group of countries there's I think been quite an impetus indirectly through cohesion policy, as part of the conditionalities, to improve the level of compliance with the state aid rules, and that was under the last period of cohesion policy, and some technical assistance was provided to facilitate some member states in developing systems that kept better track of state aids. And in the past, the Court of Auditors has expressed concern at the extent to which cohesion policy spending wasn't compatible or didn't comply fully with the state aid rules, and so that became one of the priorities in the last period. So in the end, there's a whole mix of reasons why countries end up being different, and why such different systems have emerged.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that has a question? If not, Renan, yes, feel free to unmute and also turn on your video. Thank you. I can't hear you. I don't know if I'm the only one, but it does appear as you're unmuted, so it might be your microphone. Yes, I can't hear you. If anything, you can also type it in the chat. I don't know if it's on my end, but can you hear him, Fiona?
I'm sorry, Renan. I'm not able to hear you either. Be welcome to hear your question or see your question in the chat if you're able to type it there. I don't know if I can maybe cheekily take this opportunity to ask Antoine about new developments. Obviously, it's been the period since we did the study has been very much taken up with COVID aid, but I wonder if you're able to say anything about how the transparency system might be adapted, and also whether the EU UK TCA will have an impact on the EU member states.
Yes, absolutely. So as you know, the stated modernization program in 2014 introduced the transparency at the level of the stated beneficiaries, and then came into force in 2016. And at the time, it came hand in hand with the simplified application of state rules that made it possible for member states to grant aid under the general block exempted regulation, the GBER. And then the large aid awards, which meant individual aid award above 500K for the same beneficiary and same eligible costs. So that was the threshold. But since the entry into force of the stated temporary framework to support the economy in the context of the coronavirus outbreak, the threshold has been lowered to 100,000 euros. It is also likely that this lower threshold will be kept in the ongoing revision of the stated guidelines. So we are also in the moment where there is the crisis, but there is also the revision of our stated rules, which it has an impact on transparency. And actually, it's also linked with the actual setup of the member states, so directly to your study, because as this threshold is lowered, this implies a way larger amount of data to be reported by member states in the TAM or in their national websites, which means that most member states are also modernizing their setup in order to efficiently transfer data from their register, if they have one, to the TAM, or to manage data also on their side. And we have been in contact with many member states as we get the bulk upload things, and we are fixing the way to use the model, the TAM and things like this. And we expect this modernization, let's say, of the transparency data to continue afterwards with the entry into force of the new guidelines. So that would be it, let's say, for the pure TAM thing. And for the, let's say, transparency in the United Kingdom, I am not an expert in the Brexit. Probably we have also I see the British colleagues which are there. But so as regard the aid which is granted before the end of 2020, my understanding is that the United Kingdom has still to comply with the requirement laid down in the respective decision, including on transparency, and also for the aid granted under the GBER. So the decisions for the aid which is granted after after 2021 under existing schemes, our understanding is that the decision that impose transparency remain binding anyway, because it's the old decision, even if it's new aid awards. And there is also a complication, let's say, which is because of the protocol on Northern Ireland. Because most of the stated acquis applies, so the guideline GBER and things like this, without any exemption. So it includes transparency rules to any aid that could have an impact on the trade between Northern Ireland and the European Union. So this is quite far-reaching. So the consequences there are still to be fixed, because there is a bit also at least for me, which I am not a Brexit expert, it's not straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing I can say on the TAM, the data system, let's say, and also on the Brexit side.
Excellent. That's really helpful. I see Renan's question.
Maybe we can read it out loud
in the chat. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So just so it can be registered in the recording, Renan wrote that in Italy they have a problem with the definition of activity or project in order to accumulate the aid awards. So they've been accumulating all individual aid awards for each company. The problem is that when one beneficiary reaches the 500,000 threshold, they send even older aid awards that were not higher than the threshold. In these cases, it's not fair to consider the granted date of the initial aids in order to consider a late publication. Do you have anything to say on that, Fiona?
Maybe I can start, because we have been in contact with the Italian authorities, and we agree this is something that we missed actually in one of our let's say previous exercise, because just to explain clear word, you have to accumulate the aid awards and then to assess if a member state at some point in time for a single beneficiary is higher than the 500 threshold. And at this point, you are obliged to encode the, let's say, 300K awards, but the first one might be way before, and then the publication dates, then there's in terms of let's say pure law, it's okay, but in terms of the economic the analysis that we have done, yes, indeed, that might disadvantage countries with large number of aid awards like Italy. That's correct. We are aware of this, so we take it into consideration as well.
Okay, thank you, Renan, for your comment, and thank you, Antoine, as well for your useful feedback. We have a question also from Stuart Keegan. Please go ahead.
Hi, hope you can hear me okay. Thank you very much, Professor Wishlade, for the presentation. Unfortunately, I had some technical difficulties at the very beginning, so I'm looking forward to seeing the slides. So the question, just a quick question, it might be one of the unknown unknowns, as you mentioned. You said about the value added to member states, but and those with the register. Is there any understanding of the kind of value added for undertakings operating in the union? For example, has TAM data ever been used in complaints to the Commission or in some cases? So has it ever been, the public search ever been used by companies to check if their competitors are getting aid and then lodge a complaint on the basis or something like that? Is there any understanding of that? As I said, it might be one of the unknown unknowns. Thank you.
We have been in contact with some law firms investigating the issues. To my knowledge, I don't have an example of a successful complaint on this basis. That's also, in my opinion, because the information which is reported in the TAM is rather scarce. So it would be difficult for a competitor to lodge a complaint only on this basis.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that the information on TAM is quite sparse, but it's also not very straightforward to analyze. I don't know whether somebody like Kenny has looked at trying to do this, but I know that a few years ago we did. We looked at regional aid, and it was actually quite difficult to really to extract the information in a meaningful way and understand different categories of spending. I don't know whether there is a way of making it easier to access or easier to download. I mean, it now runs to I think certainly a couple of thousand pages when you open it up, if you don't input any search criteria. And there is some evidence, I think, that the criteria that are input by awarding bodies aren't always used, aren't always used systematically. For instance, like categories of aid, what their policy targets are, that makes it quite difficult. I mean, I don't know whether Kenny has anything to say from Goods Jobs First, which compiles this kind of data for the US, and whether you have any thoughts on Kenny, on what might make it more transparent or useful.
Well, I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. I mean, in some ways, I found, working from the case register, the ISAF register, came very intuitively to me. I'd look up a case, I'd see how much was awarded, at the end of the decision process. And that was useful, but I'm still trying to I haven't used the TAM enough to still have an intuitive feel of that yet. So I'm not sure exactly like what kind of a grade I would give it. I go back to my old professor roots, right? But yeah, I'm still learning my way around it. And right now, my research interests are pretty narrow.
Yeah, but the Good Jobs First register is actively used as part of a lobbying activity on corporate welfare, as I understand it.
Yes, I mean, that's, the amount we have, I think a little over 250,000 individual awards in the United States in our database, which is called Subsea Tracker. And yeah, I mean, that we've put that together so you can search by company, and so you can search by the state where the aid is awarded, that sort of thing. But our interest in some U.S. companies going abroad is quite new.
Okay.
We have about 5-6 minutes left until the hour. We have time for another question then. So feel free to unmute and ask it. If not, then I would have maybe a question for you, Fiona, regarding recommendations and maybe changes that might be coming up. So you mentioned that different countries also, some of the type 1 countries didn't want any additional reporting burdens. Type 2 countries do not want any changes that could disrupt existing systems. What does that mean then for state aid in the next few months, years?
Well, I mean, I think Antoine has picked up some of those points. And I think the COVID crisis has meant that things have moved on a little bit since we did the report. I think it would be good to have a better handle on the degree of compliance than we can get at the moment with our sort of like unknown unknowns. But I think from a policy perspective, it seems in some respects a little bit disappointing that maybe the data hasn't been used really either by academic researchers, and I'm not sure whether it's really been used by the commission either, although that was one of the initial aims, was to have a better understanding of what member states do by tracking these very large or relatively large awards.
I can reassure you, we do use the content of the TAM, and indeed it requires some cleaning and things like this. It's not straightforward. I want to stress that the Commission sees also the future with more data, because it allows to understand what's occurring in the field. And I think we all see in the COVID-19 crisis the importance of tracking tracking the numbers. It's also for policy to see, okay, I've implemented the state aid schemes to who actually received the money that did work. Can I do an econometric or even a statistical analysis to understand if it was useful, so that in the next crisis or in the renewal of the scheme, I will not do the same mistakes. For us, this is something which is extremely important. So we are also investing in our IT tool. We have also reduced the threshold for the moment in the COVID-19 stated transparency requirement. So that's the important for us, that we have data which will be useful for us. We also encourage member states to collect data for themselves to use eventually to blend with the corporate tax registers with any kind of register you have to use this data for policy, for insight, also for enforcement. That's things we are interested in, and it means that for some member states are already investing in their IT system, because it helps to track the data, and we know this is work. It's already 5 years that the transparency requirement entered into force, and we are building something which is useful. We will try to do also our part in the Commission to make this data useful for member states, for the players in the market, but also for researchers. When probably we will have more time after the crisis, we will try to see how we can communicate and also explain a bit what are our methodologies to claim the data, to clean the data, and also for research purposes. And I think, Fiona, you mentioned in the study that it was not possible to include the member state with a national setup. I think it's also for researchers, for the market players, it also shows that it is difficult to access if the information is split into 27 or even 28 different registers. If it's regional register and things like this, the information is encoded in different language under different regulation. This is something which really reduce the usability of the data.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so we're coming up on the hour, and I'll just like to thank you, Fiona, and also thank you, Antoine, for your key insights from the Commission. And thank you to everyone for your interest in today's webinar. Our next webinar will take place on Wednesday, April 28th, when Dr. Hugo Pinto will present on socioeconomic crisis, regional resilience, and the pandemic, specifically the case of Portugal. So please use the same contact email you used to register for this webinar to register for our mailing list and keep up to date on future events. We hope to see you again then. Thank you. Have a good day.